They had slain gods and nightmares, birthed in blood and madness, and for their reward, they became one. The hunter, having consumed the chords of creation and overcome the pale moon's embrace, had become an infant great one, a being of impossible cosmic significance. But the cosmos is vast, and its currents are fickle. One nightmare had ended, only for another to begin. There was a sense of falling, of unraveling, a dissolution of the vast, squirming consciousness they had become. They had traded one nightmare for another, a story of blood and steel that we will now unfold. If you crave tales of impossible heroes clashing with the shadows of a new world, smash that subscribe button and bear witness to a new, endless hunt. The recoalescence was jarring. Sensation returned not as a gentle tide, but as a violent slam. Cold, wet, hard. The hunter's eyes snapped open to a sky the color of bruised plums, weeping a steady, miserable drizzle. They lay not on the soft loam of the dream's garden, but on rough, uneven cobblestones, slick with grime and rainwater. The air was the first profound violation. It was thick with alien scents, the acrid burn of unknown fuels, the cloying sweetness of processed foods, 100,000 odors of life packed too closely together. Towering structures of brick and glass blotted out the sky, their sheer faces lit with an unnatural electric luminescence that cast long, dancing shadows. Hulking metal carriages roared past the mouth of the alley, propelled by some unseen, clamorous force, their bright eyes cutting through the gloom. This was not Yharnam. The architecture was wrong, the technology was witchcraft, and the very air hummed with a different kind of madness. The hunter pushed themselves up, every muscle coiled with the deeply ingrained tension of a creature perpetually at war. Their attire, the familiar leather and thick cloth of the hunter set, felt heavy and damp. A quick instinctive check confirmed their tools were with them. The folded saw cleaver was secure on their back, its familiar weight a small, hard point of certainty in this sea of chaos. The hunter pistol, nestled in its holster, was cold against their thigh. They patted their coat, feeling the reassuring bulges of a scant few blood vials and a handful of quicksilver bullets. Finite. The thought was a cold spike of dread. Here, there was no workshop, no doll, no dream to grant them respite and replenishment. Yet, amidst the overwhelming sensory assault, one scent cut through the noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. Blood. It wasn't the metallic beastly tang of the scourge, nor the thin, ethereal ichor of the kin. This was a crude scent, thick and polluted, like spoiled meat, but it was a scent of predation, of violence, of death. It was the only familiar song in this alien world, and the hunter's feet moved before their mind could object, drawn by the primal, irresistible call of the hunt. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, a predator's grace that was utterly at odds with the mundane setting. Their steps were silent on the wet stone, their form melting into the deepest shadows of the narrow alley. The scent grew stronger, leading them towards a small derelict courtyard cluttered with overflowing refuse bins. There, under the flickering hum of a faulty security light, where the hunt revealed itself. 3 figures were hunched over a fourth, who was feebly struggling on the ground. The attackers were pallid and grotesque, their movements stiff and uncoordinated. They wore the tattered remnants of modern clothing, but their eyes were vacant, their mouths stretched into slack-jawed, drooling approximations of a grin as they tore at the victim with clumsy, tearing bites. Ghouls. That was the only word the hunter's mind could supply, a pale imitation of the horrors they knew. These were not beasts born of the old blood. They were slow, shambling, pathetic things. An insult, a perversion of the pure, exhilarating terror of a true hunt. A low growl, more felt than heard, rumbled in the hunter's chest. There was no thrill here, no worthy prey. There was only filth to be cleansed. With a flick of the wrist, where the saw cleaver snapped open, its serrated edge gleaming in the dim light. The hunter exploded from the shadows. The nearest ghoul turned, its dead eyes widening slightly, but it was too slow. A blur of motion, a flash of steel. The cleaver descended in a whistling arc, biting deep into the creature's shoulder and shearing through its torso with a wet, grinding crunch. It collapsed in a heap of severed limbs and foul-smelling viscera. The other two reacted, lurching towards the hunter with guttural moans. The hunter sidestepped the first clumsy swipe, the move economical and swift, bringing the butt of the cleaver up to shatter the ghoul's jaw. As it staggered back, the hunter smoothly drew their pistol. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the enclosed space. Not a parry, but a punctuation. The heavy lead ball tore through the ghoul's chest, sending it sprawling. The final creature hesitated, a flicker of base animal cunning in its dead eyes. It was a fatal pause. The hunter closed the distance in a single, impossibly fast step, their left hand lashing out. Fingers like iron talons plunged into the ghoul's chest, seeking purchase, a visceral, instinctive motion honed over countless battles. But there was nothing to grip, no monstrous heart to tear free. Only rotting flesh. A flicker of disappointment, then adaptation. The hunter's grip tightened, and with a heave, they simply ripped the creature's torso asunder. Silence descended, broken only by the patter of rain and the dying gurgles of the victim. The hunter stood over the dismembered corpses, the cleaver dripping. A familiar ritual, a bloody sacrament. But something was wrong. They felt nothing. No ethereal whispers, no surge of insight, no resonant hum of blood echoes being absorbed into their soul. The kills were hollow, granting only the grim satisfaction of a task completed. This new reality did not reward the hunt. Headlights flooded the alley's entrance, pinning the hunter in their glare. The squeal of tires on wet asphalt echoed off the brick walls as two black, unmarked vans screeched to a halt, blocking the only exit. Doors slid open and armored figures spilled out, their movements disciplined and professional. They wore dark uniforms, adorned with a cryptic symbol, and carried weapons of a design the hunter had never seen. "Freeze! Drop your weapon!" a voice commanded, sharp and authoritative through some sort of mechanical speaker. The soldiers formed a cordon, their weapons all leveled at the lone, blood-soaked figure standing amidst the carnage. The hunt, it seemed, was far from over. The command to freeze was a sound, nothing more. A vibration in the alien air. The hunter understood intent, not language, and the intent of the dozen figures arrayed before them was clear. Containment. Their posture was rigid, their aim steady. They were soldiers, not the frenzied mobs of Yharnam. They were hunters of a different sort, and their prey, for the moment, was them. The hunter's knuckles were white where they gripped the saw cleaver. A single explosive lunge, a quick step to the left, and they could be among them. The strange black-barreled weapons would be useless at such a range. A whirlwind of steel and blood would follow. It would be easy, too easy. But what would it achieve? They were a ghost in this world, an anomaly. To carve a path of bodies now would be to announce their presence in the only way they knew how, as inviting only greater and more overwhelming force. Their resources were finite, their mortality a new and terrifying certainty. A reckless charge was a fool's gambit, the act of a beast, not a hunter. A hunter observes, learns, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. This was not that moment. With a deliberate, almost languid motion that seemed to suck the tension from the air, the hunter relaxed their grip. The saw cleaver was an extension of their arm, and they swung it in a practiced arc, flicking the gore from its teeth. Then, with a loud, metallic clack, they folded the weapon back into its compact form and laid it on the wet cobblestones. A collective, unseen sigh of relief seemed to pass through the soldiers. "Target is disarming," the lead voice crackled over their internal comms. "Proceed with caution, so subdue and secure." 2 soldiers broke from the line, advancing slowly, their weapons still raised. They carried heavy, metallic restraints. The hunter remained perfectly still, their heads slightly cocked, watching their approach. The soldiers were tense, their movements jerky. They clearly expected a trick, a sudden explosion of violence. But none came. The hunter offered no resistance as the cold, heavy cuffs were locked around their wrists. They were searched, their pistol, vials, and bullets removed with a professional efficiency that spoke of long practice with disarming unusual hostiles. No identification, no wallet. Just this, one soldier said, holding up a blood vial. The syringe mechanism was archaic, the blood within unnaturally dark. And these bullets, they're filled with some kind of quicksilver compound. Sir Integra will want to see this. The journey was a disorienting blur of smeared city lights seen through the narrow, barred window of the van. The hunter sat in silence, observing the soldiers who sat opposite them, their weapons still trained. They were a coiled spring, an engine of violence momentarily at rest. The soldiers felt it. The air in the van was thick with a predatory stillness that had nothing to do with the mundane act of transporting a prisoner. It was the feeling of being caged with something that only chose to be there. They drove for what felt like an eternity before leaving the dense, bright heart of the city behind, eventually passing through a set of imposing wrought iron gates. A sprawling manor loomed out of the darkness, in a Gothic silhouette of spires and gargoyles that was both hauntingly familiar and deeply wrong. It had the shape of Yharnam's grandeur, but lacked its decay, its madness. This was a fortress, clean and maintained, a bastion of power, not a tomb of forgotten secrets. The vehicle descended into a subterranean entrance, the world dissolving into the sterile white light of a modern military facility, hidden beneath the estate's old bones. The hunter was led through a series of stark, concrete corridors, their bare feet silent on the polished floor. The cuffs were removed, only for them to be placed in a small, featureless room. A single steel table was bolted to the floor with a chair on either side. One wall was a sheet of dark, reflective glass, an observation room, a cage for study. The hunter stood in the center of the room, unmoving, on a statue of worn leather and dried blood. They waited. The door opened with a quiet hiss. The woman who entered was not a soldier. She radiated an authority that required no uniform, a will of iron that was a weapon in its own right. She was tall and slender, with severe blonde hair and sharp blue eyes behind thin spectacles, a dark suit, a cravat, and in her hand, a smoldering cigar. This was the one in command, the Alpha. Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates. Hellsing strode into the room and took the seat opposite the hunter, placing a file on the table between them. She did not seem intimidated. She seemed annoyed, as if this strange, bloody affair was merely an unwelcome deviation from her schedule. "My men recovered you from a back alley in Southwark," she began, her voice crisp and aristocratic, laced with steel. She didn't ask a question. She stated a fact. "You had just finished dismembering 3 individuals whom we have identified as ghouls. According to the field report, you did so with a level of speed and brutality that my most senior operatives found noteworthy." She took a slow drag from her cigar, letting the smoke curl towards the ceiling. Her eyes never left the hunter. They were analytical, piercing, dissecting them piece by piece. "Your clothing is anachronistic. Your weaponry is a blacksmith's nightmare. You carry no identification of any kind. When you move, you are silent. When you fight, you are inhumanly fast. You are not a vampire. You have no scent of the grave about you. You are not a ghoul. You possess a chilling degree of tactical awareness. So, I'm left with a very simple, yet profoundly important question." She leaned forward, her gaze intensifying, the embers of her cigar burning like a single demonic eye in the sterile room. "What the hell are you?" The hunter did not respond. Their head, which had been slightly bowed, lifted. Their eyes, hidden in the shadow of their tricorn hat, met Integra's. There was no fear in that gaze, no confusion. There was only the cold, bottomless calm of a being that had stared into the abyss and seen it blink first. They were sizing her up, just as she was them. Two apex predators, separated by a table and a universe of experience, each trying to understand the nature of the monster before them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, a battle of wills waged in the utter absence of words. Integra Hellsing was not a patient woman. She was the commander of an organization that stood as humanity's final, blood-soaked bulwark against the supernatural. She had faced down ancient vampires, fanatical priests, and the resurrected armies of hell itself. She did not have time for silent, enigmatic strangers, no matter how proficient they were at butchery. Her frustration was a palpable force in the sterile room, a pressure that would have made lesser men crumble and confess to sins they had not even committed. The hunter, however, was not a man. Not anymore. They simply stood, their presence an unmoving, unreadable void in the heart of her fortress. "I will have an answer," Integra stated, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Either from you or from your corpse." As if summoned by the promise of violence, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to deepen, coalescing into a form that defied the sterile geometry of the concrete walls. A low, mocking chuckle echoed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Now, my master," the voice purred, dripping with an ancient, predatory amusement. "Is that any way to treat a potential new pet?" A tall, impossibly thin figure bled out of the darkness, a fluid silhouette of crimson and black. He wore a ludicrously archaic outfit, a charcoal suit, a sprawling red duster, and a wide-brimmed fedora that cast his face in deep shadow. A pair of orange-lensed glasses glinted, reflecting the room's cold light, but they could not hide the blood-red, luminous eyes that burned behind them. Alucard, the Hellsing Organization's ultimate weapon and darkest secret, had arrived. He had not used the door. He flowed across the room with the grace of spilled ink, his grin a slash of white teeth in the gloom. He came to a stop beside Integra's chair, his towering frame casting a long, distorted shadow over the hunter. "So," he mused, his voice a silken rasp, "this is the little stray that has caused such a commotion, a human who fights like a demon. How utterly fascinating." Alucard's senses, honed over centuries of slaughter, reached out to taste the creature before him. He expected to find something familiar, the cold stillness of the undead, the sulphurous taint of a demon, the faint psychic hum of a blessed priest, or even the simple, terrified thrum of a human heart. He found none of it. There was a heartbeat. Yes, but it was unnaturally steady, a slow, powerful rhythm like a war drum. There was a scent, but it was only of old leather, unrain, and the sticky sweet iron of blood. Blood that was not its own. The hunter's soul, if they even had one, was a closed door. A fortress. Alucard's gaze, which could strip a man's sanity bare and leave him a gibbering wreck, met only a placid, bottomless calm. The hunter's head tilted slightly, their unseen eyes tracking the vampire's every move. This one was different. It reeked of blood, old and powerful. It carried the weight of 1,000 murders. It was a beast of the highest order, a true monster pretending at civility. The hunter's hand twitched, an echo of the instinct to reach for their cleaver. "You are quiet," Alucard crooned, stepping forward, his grin widening. "Don't you know it's rude not to introduce yourself?" He let a fraction of his power bleed out, like an aura of terror and dominance that could freeze blood in the veins. The air grew cold. Shadows writhed on the walls, twisting into the forms of screaming faces and grasping claws. It was a simple party trick, but one that had broken cardinals and warlords. The hunter did not flinch. They had seen the cosmos bleed. They had stood before the writhing, tentacled patrons of a madman's dream. A vampire's parlor tricks were less than nothing. Alucard's grin faltered for a barest fraction of a second. This was new. The lack of fear was not born of bravado or ignorance. It was born of experience. This creature had seen worse things in the dark than him. "What do you see, Alucard?" Integra demanded, her own patience wearing thin. "I see a puzzle, my master," the vampire replied, his tone losing some of its mockery, replaced by a genuine and hungry curiosity. He closed his eyes, his third psychic eye opening to the unseen world. He pushed his perception past the physical, past the spiritual, and into the very essence of the being before him. He was prepared for anything. He was wrong. What he saw was not a memory. It was a scar, a psychic wound burned into the fabric of a soul. He was assaulted by a torrent of alien sensations, the ringing of a celestial bell, the scent of incense and rotting flesh, the chilling whisper of pale blood. He saw a Gothic city, far older and sicker than London, drowning under the weight of a perpetual, blood-moon-tinged night. He saw men twisting into horrific, hirsute beasts, their bones cracking and reforming. He saw pale, bulbous-headed things staring from the rafters of a grand cathedral, their minds extensions of a greater, more unthinking consciousness. He felt the crushing, psychic weight of a dreaming god, its mere presence a poison to reality. He saw the hunt, an endless, looping, blood-drenched sacrament. Die, awaken, hunt, die, awaken, hunt. The cycle was etched into the hunter's being, a purpose so absolute that it had scoured away whatever personality had once been there. And through it all, he felt the echoes of blood. Blood as a cure, blood as a poison, blood as a currency, blood as a pathway to ascension. This creature was not merely covered in blood. It was defined by it, fueled by it in a way that was a profound perversion of Alucard's own vampiric nature. Alucard's eyes snapped open, and for the first time in centuries, there was something other than amusement or contempt in them. It was a flicker of shock. He took an involuntary step back, not a gesture so uncharacteristic that it caused Integra to sit bolt upright. "This is no human," Alucard whispered, his voice losing all its theatricality, becoming flat and serious. He stared at the hunter, no longer seeing a stray but a fellow predator, a monster from a different and perhaps even darker nightmare than his own. They are a survivor of a holy war fought with filth and madness. They have feasted on the hearts of gods and bathed in the blood of nightmares. He finally turned to face Integra, his red eyes burning with a newfound terrifying respect. "Master," he said, a true predatory grin finally returning to his face. "Whatever it is, I want to see it fight." The hunter was given a choice, though it was not presented in words. Integra laid two objects on the cold steel table of the interrogation room. On one side, the new set of the heavy, metallic restraints. On the other, the hunter's own folded saw cleaver. The meaning was clear, a universal language of steel and intent. Captivity, or the hunt. There was no choice at all. The hunter's hand moved without hesitation, their fingers curling around the familiar leather-wrapped handle of their weapon. The deal was struck. They were a weapon, a tool to be pointed. They understood this arrangement. In Yharnam, they had been a tool of the dream, guided by the cryptic notes of a long-dead Gehrman. Here, they were a tool of a severe woman with a cigar. The master had changed, but the purpose remained the same. Hunt, kill, survive. Their first assignment came quickly. They were led to a briefing room, a stark chamber dominated by a large screen. A grizzled man with an eye patch and the easy, cynical air of a lifelong mercenary stood beside Integra. He introduced himself as Pip Bernadotte, captain of the wild geese. He and his men were to be the hunter's escort. Pip looked the hunter up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "So this is the boogeyman. Looks a bit underdressed for a firefight." His comment was ignored. Integra began the briefing. On the screen flashed reconnaissance photos of a disused medical facility on the outskirts of Dublin. She spoke of intelligence, of a rogue German doctor, and of unnatural biological experiments. The words were meaningless noise to the hunter, but the images were not. They showed bodies, twisted and pale, with the same slack-jawed emptiness as the ghouls from the alley. But these were different. There were surgical scars visible, crude cybernetic implants, crudely sutured to flesh, and a uniformity to their vacant expressions that spoke not of a plague, but of a production line. One of the soldiers muttered something about a freak chip. Pip explained for the benefit of his men that Millennium wasn't just recruiting old Nazis. They were building an army of artificial vampires, bypassing the slow and unreliable process of natural infection. They were manufacturing monsters. The hunter stared at the images, a new and unfamiliar emotion stirring within them. It was a cold, pure disgust. The scourge of beasts in Yharnam had been a tragedy, a horrifying curse born from the hubris of seeking communion with the cosmos. It was a plague with a grim, almost spiritual weight. The beasts it created were creatures of instinct and rage, worthy of the hunt. This was a mockery, an assembly line of abominations, soulless puppets created by the petty ambitions of men. It was a perversion of the scourge, a cheap imitation of a true nightmare. It was filth, an offense that had to be scoured clean not for survival, but for the principle of the thing. The infiltration was a study in contrasts. The wild geese moved with practiced military stealth, using cover, communicating with crisp hand signals. The hunter simply melted into the shadows. They moved as if the darkness were their natural habitat, their leather-clad form making no sound on the gravel surrounding the facility. They reached the entrance point, a rusted-over maintenance hatch, a full minute before Pip's squad, standing beside it like a phantom that had been waiting there all along. The mercenaries exchanged uneasy glances. Inside, the stench of antiseptic and rot filled the air. And they moved through darkened corridors lined with humming, unfamiliar machinery. The place was a laboratory, but a crude one, more abattoir than research center. Then they found them. In a large open ward, a dozen of the artificial vampires stood motionless in charging alcoves, their heads lolling, their pale skin crisscrossed with wires and sutures. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and the creatures stirred. Their heads snapped up in unison, their eyes glowing with a faint, electronic red light. They were activated. With jerky, unnatural movements, they stepped from their alcoves and charged, their mouths opening in silent, synchronized screams. The wild geese opened fire, their assault rifles barking in the enclosed space, tearing chunks from the advancing horrors. But the things barely staggered, to their movements driven by circuits and doped blood, not a nervous system that could register pain. Before Pip could shout an order, the hunter was moving. They became a blur of black leather and dark steel. They flowed past the mercenaries' firing line, the saw cleaver snapping open with a hungry rasp. The first freak lunged, and the hunter met it not with force, but with fluid grace. A quick step, faster than the eye could follow, put them at the creature's flank. The cleaver sang, not in a crude hack, but in a precise, dismembering arc that severed both legs at the hip. The creature toppled, twitching. This was not a hunt. It was an extermination. The hunter moved with a cold, contemptuous fury. Their movements, usually a dance of death and visceral thrill, were now brutally economical. There was no parrying, to no search for an opening for a glorious, visceral strike. These things were not worthy of such rites. They were objects to be broken. The hunter's cleaver rose and fell, shearing through limbs, splitting torsos, crushing skulls. They were a whirlwind of focused, mechanical destruction. At one point, they slammed their free hand into the chest of a freak, the instinctive motion of a visceral attack. Their fingers met not soft flesh and a frantic, beating heart, but a hard, metallic plate and a bundle of wires. The sheer wrongness of it fueled their rage. With a guttural snarl, they simply ripped the entire chest plate out, sending sparks flying as the puppet collapsed. Pip and his men ceased firing, their guns lowered as they watched the spectacle. They had fought vampires before. They had seen Alucard unleash hell. But this was different. This was not a monster reveling in slaughter. This was a craftsman at their grim work, dismantling broken machines with a chilling, detached efficiency. "Mon Dieu," Pip breathed, his cigarette falling from his lips. "He doesn't fight them. He purges them." In less than a minute, it was over. The hunter stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a scrap heap of twitching limbs, severed wires, and splattered synthetic blood. Their cleaver dripped, but there were no blood echoes to absorb. No thrill of the kill. They looked upon the carnage, and their posture radiated not triumph, but a profound, almost holy offense. They had not hunted beasts. They had merely taken out the trash. The rain in Northern Ireland had a different character from the miserable drizzle of London. It was a colder, more ancient rain, a persistent mist that clung to the rolling green hills and whispered through the ruins of forgotten chapels. It was a land soaked in blood and belief, a perfect hunting ground. The hunter stood on a ridge overlooking a valley, the wind whipping at their long coat. Below, nestled in a copse of skeletal trees, was a derelict stone church, its steeple a broken finger pointing accusingly at the perpetually grey sky. Pip Bernadotte crouched nearby, peering through a pair of binoculars. "There it is," he grunted, the tip of his cigarette glowing in the gloom. "Millennium's little clubhouse. Intel says a second-tier officer is inside, coordinating recruitment of local paramilitaries. We go in, kill him, burn everything." The wild geese were spread out behind them, checking their weapons, their faces grim. They had grown accustomed to the hunter's silence, but not to the unsettling aura of coiled violence that surrounded them. They treated the hunter less like a comrade and more like a leashed wolf that might at any moment decide its handlers looked tastier than the designated prey. "There's a complication," Pip added, lowering his binoculars. "Our contacts in the Vatican have gone silent. Iscariot has been sniffing around this area for a week. We might have company." The name Iscariot meant nothing to the hunter. They were all just names for different packs, different tribes. The mission was the only thing that mattered. The target was in the church, the rest was just noise, potential obstacles on the path to the prey. And they gave Pip a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The hunt was on. The approach was a masterclass in silent death. The Millennium sentries posted in the graveyard surrounding the church never saw them coming. The hunter moved from shadow to shadow, a ghost in the mist, their saw cleaver unfolding and closing with barely a whisper of steel. A severed head rolled behind a tombstone here, a bisected torso slumped against a Celtic cross there. The wild geese followed in their wake, securing the perimeter, their faces a mixture of awe and revulsion. The church doors were thick, ancient oak. The mercenaries began setting a breaching charge. The hunter simply placed a hand on the wood, found a purchase, and tore the door from its rusted hinges with a screech of tortured metal. They were inside before the splinters had settled. At the church's nave was a scene of desecration. Pews were overturned, the altar draped with the monstrous eagle of the Third Reich, and a half-dozen of the same artificial vampires from Dublin stood guard. They turned in unison, their red-lit eyes fixing on the intruder. Before the wild geese could even get a clear line of sight, the slaughter began. This time, the hunter felt a flicker of the old fire. These freaks were guarding a place of worship, a hollowed-out icon of faith. It was a familiar blasphemy, echoing the corruption of the healing church. The cleaver became an instrument of righteous fury. The hunter's movements were a blur, a whirlwind of dodges and devastating strikes. They shattered a freak's leg with a kick, then brought the serrated edge of their weapon down on its neck, to the grinding sound of steel on bone echoing through the nave. They fired their pistol, the quicksilver bullet impacting a ghoul's chest, not to kill, but to stagger it, to create the barest opening. A follow-up strike from the cleaver took the creature's arm and head in a single, fluid motion. It was in the midst of this bloody ballet that the world exploded in a shower of colored glass and holy scripture. A massive figure crashed through the stained glass window of the apse, landing in a crouch that cracked the stone floor. He was a mountain of a man, clad in the simple gray cassock of a priest, with round spectacles and a shock of blonde hair. But there was nothing gentle about him. He rose to his full, towering height, a beatific, bloodthirsty smile on his face. In each hand, he held a pair of wickedly long, triple-bladed bayonets. "Amen," the man bellowed, his voice a cannonade that dwarfed the sound of the storm outside. It was Alexander Anderson, paladin of the Hellsing Organization, the Vatican's trump card. His eyes, burning with fanatical light, took in the scene. The Hellsing mercenaries, the Nazi abominations, and the strange, dark figure at the center of it all, dripping with gore. He saw only heretics and monsters, a nest of vipers to be purged. "And what have we here?" he roared, his grin widening. "Protestant dogs consorting with Nazi filth and a demon to lead their unholy choir. The Lord's work is never done." With a flick of his wrists, he sent a dozen blessed bayonets whistling through the air. The wild geese scrambled for cover, but the hunter simply moved. They sidestepped, weaved, and ducked, through the holy blades slicing the air where they had been a millisecond before, thudding into the stone walls and wooden pews around them. The hunter's attention snapped from the remaining freaks to this new, far more interesting prey. This one was different. He was not a shambling puppet or a mindless beast. He burned with purpose, with a fire that was almost as bright and consuming as their own thirst for the hunt. He was worthy. Anderson charged, a juggernaut of faith and fury. "Speak, demon! What circle of hell spat you out?" He slashed with his bayonets, a whirlwind of consecrated steel. The hunter met his charge, their saw cleaver clashing against the blessed blades. Sparks flew, the clang of the impact ringing like a funeral bell. The force was immense, but the hunter absorbed it, on redirecting the momentum in a fluid parry that sent Anderson stumbling a single step. It was enough. The hunter fired their pistol. The quicksilver bullet slammed into Anderson's chest. For any other foe, this would have been the moment of truth, the opening for a visceral, soul-tearing strike. Anderson staggered, a look of genuine surprise on his face, but his flesh, it healed. Green-tinged, thorny vines of scripture and holy power knitted the wound shut in an instant. He was not stunned. He was merely annoyed. "A clever trick, beast," he laughed, "but you face a miracle of God, not a creature of flesh and blood." He lunged again, faster this time. The hunter was forced onto the defensive, their quick steps and dodges barely keeping them ahead of the storm of bayonets. This was a true duel. The cold, godless pragmatism of the hunt against the burning, zealous fury of a holy crusade. One fought in silence, a being of pure, lethal function. The other fought with laughter and scripture, a monster reveling in his divine purpose. Anderson could not understand what he was fighting. It was fast, impossibly so. It fought with the skill of a master swordsman and the ferocity of a cornered animal. Yet it had no scent of hellfire, no vampiric taint. When his blessed blades cut its leather coat, the blood that welled up was dark and mortal. But no creature of mortal blood should be able to move like this, to meet his charge and not be shattered. "What are you?" he roared, his frustration mounting as the silent, dark figure once again slipped through his guard like smoke. He was fighting a ghost, a question mark made of leather and steel. Mawson, for the first time, the paladin felt not just righteous fury, but a sliver of genuine, maddening confusion. The duel devolved into a storm of sacred steel and profane speed. The church nave became their arena, a consecrated space defiled by a battle between two impossible beings. Pip and the wild geese could do nothing but press themselves against the walls, occasionally firing a burst at the remaining Millennium freaks who were drawn into the fray, only to be cut down by a stray bayonet from Anderson or a contemptuous backhand from the hunter. This was a battle beyond their weight class, a clash of gods and monsters in a crumbling house of worship. Anderson was a force of nature, a hurricane of righteous fury. He laughed as he fought, his voice booming over the storm. Is that all, beast? A few clever steps, a pop gun that tickles? They face the wrath of God's chosen and repent. He smashed a heavy oak pew with a single blow, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The hunter flowed around the debris, their feet never seeming to touch the ground for more than a second. They were a whisper, a shadow, a question that Anderson could not answer. He could feel it now, the deep, profound wrongness of his opponent. With every clash of blades, he felt the impact shudder up his arms, the solid, unyielding strength of a mortal frame that should have shattered. He saw the hunter's blood, their dark, ordinary blood, well up from a shallow cut on their cheek, and it did not sizzle or steam as unholy blood should when exposed to the consecrated air of the church. It simply dripped. His own body was a testament to the divine. And when the hunter's cleaver scored a deep gash across his chest, the wound squirmed and closed, thorny tendrils of biblical pages and green energy stitching the flesh back together. It was a miracle, a testament to his faith. The hunter, however, did not heal. The cuts they sustained, minor as they were, remained. They fought with the weight of their own mortality, a concept Anderson had long since transcended. And yet they did not slow. They did not show pain. They simply fought. This wasn't a fight against a creature of sin. Sin was born of desire, of pride, of gluttony. Anderson knew the faces of sin. This was different. There was no desire in the hunter's movements, no rage, only a chilling, relentless purpose. It was the purpose of a tool, of an instrument designed for a single, bloody task. It was a penance, and that was the word that struck him, a bolt of theological lightning. This creature fought like a penitent flagellant, whipping itself against the body of its enemy in an endless, joyless ritual. What sin could you have possibly committed to deserve such a sentence? Anderson roared, not as a taunt, but as a genuine, desperate question. He ripped a page from the Bible tucked in his jacket and slapped it to a stone pillar. Ask, and ye shall receive. The paper glowed with a pale light. He threw a volley of bayonets, forcing the hunter to dodge behind a different pillar. As they did, Anderson teleported, vanishing from his position and reappearing from the glowing page, his blades descending in a lethal pincer attack. It was a tactic that had slain countless vampires, a divine trick that bent space and reason. The hunter did not see the magic. They did not need to. They felt the shift in the air, the subtle displacement of presence. At the last possible microsecond, they dropped, not stepping or dodging, but collapsing into a low, inhuman crouch as the bayonets scythed through the air where their head had been. They came up spinning, the serrated edge of the cleaver screaming as it carved a deep groove into Anderson's side. Anderson bellowed, more in surprise than pain, as the wound began its slow, miraculous mending. He finally had his answer. This creature was not a demon. Demons were proud. This thing was empty. It was not a vampire. Vampires were gluttonous. This thing was abstinent. It was a new form of blasphemy, a heresy of purpose. It possessed the righteous, single-minded fury of a holy warrior, the unstoppable drive of a true believer. But it was fueled by a profane, godless power. It was a church with no God, a prayer with no meaning, a crusade with no destination. I see you now, Anderson whispered, his voice suddenly devoid of its usual bombast. He stood straight, his bayonets held loosely at his sides, a look of profound, horrified pity on his face. You are a walking penance, an empty vessel, scoured clean of whatever soul you once had, filled now with only the hunt, a holy warrior for a dead god, fighting a war that no one remembers. He raised his bayonets, his eyes burning with a new, colder fire. It was not the fire of righteous anger anymore. It was the fire of the exorcist, the surgeon who must cut away the incurable tumor. "You are the ultimate heretic," Alexander Anderson declared, his voice ringing with the finality of a death sentence. "And it is a priest's duty to grant you absolution." Before he could charge again, the sharp staccato bark of Pip's assault rifle cut through the air. The Millennium officer, who had been cowering behind the desecrated altar, finally made a break for a side door. "He's getting away!" Pip yelled. The spell of the duel was broken. The primary objective took precedence. The hunter's head snapped towards the fleeing officer, the scent of the true prey overriding the challenge of the priest. Anderson, too, turned, his duty as a slayer of monsters momentarily overriding his theological crisis. The enemy of my enemy. For a brief, bizarre moment, the three factions, Hellsing, Iscariot, and the Lone Hunter, were united in their singular focus on the escaping Nazi. The temporary, unspoken truce lasted only as long as their shared target was in sight. The Millennium officer, a doughy man in a pristine uniform, scrambled through a sacristy door. The hunter was the first to react, their focus shifting with the immediacy of a predator spotting weaker prey. They bounded over the ruined altar, a black-clad wraith ignoring the priest who was, a moment ago, their entire world. Anderson, bellowing a curse about Protestant incompetence, followed suit, his long legs eating up the distance. Pip and his men scrambled to keep up, laying down covering fire as the last of the artificial ghouls made a final, twitching stand. The chase led them into the catacombs beneath the church, a labyrinth of damp stone and ancient tombs. The air grew cold and stale, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. The officer was clumsy, his polished boots slipping on the slick flagstones, his panicked breaths echoing in the narrow passageways. The hunter, in contrast, was utterly silent, a phantom gliding through the darkness, their pace relentless and fluid. They cornered him in a burial chamber, a circular room lined with crumbling sarcophagi. The officer fumbled with a strange, ornate pistol, his hands trembling. "Stay back! I serve the Major! I'm a soldier of the last battalion!" he shrieked, his voice a pathetic squeak in the oppressive silence. The hunter did not slow. The officer fired. The bullet was not a simple projectile. It was a streak of crimson energy, humming with an unnatural power. The hunter's instincts, honed against the eldritch magic of Yharnam scholars, screamed a warning. They quick-stepped, nor the bolt of energy searing the air where they had been, striking a stone coffin and blasting a chunk of it into dust. Before the officer could fire again, the hunter was on him. The kill was brutally efficient. The saw cleaver snapped open and descended, silencing the officer's scream before it had fully formed. But as the hunter stood over the bisected corpse, a flicker of movement caught their eye. A small, metallic object, dislodged from the officer's belt, had rolled into a dark corner. It was blinking with a tiny, insistent red light. The hunter's mind, which processed violence and threat vectors with inhuman speed, did not understand the specifics of the technology, but it understood the universal language of a trap, a final, spiteful act. Without a moment's hesitation, they turned, grabbing the front of Anderson's cassock, the priest having just entered the chamber, and hurled him back out of the doorway with a surge of impossible strength. "What devilry is—" Anderson started to roar, just as the world turned white. The explosion was immense, a contained detonation designed to bring the catacombs down. The ceiling gave way with a deafening groan, tons of ancient stone and earth crashing down into the burial chamber. Anderson was thrown clear by the hunter's shove, blasted back into the corridor amidst a shower of rock and dust. Pip and his men, just rounding the corner, were knocked off their feet by the shockwave. Silence followed, thick and suffocating, broken only by the trickle of dust and the pained groans of the mercenaries. Anderson was the first to his feet, his ears ringing. His body bruised but already healing, he stared at the wall of rubble that now blocked the chamber. The heretic, the strange, silent penitent, had saved him. It had thrown him to safety, choosing to face the blow alone. It made no sense. "Sir, are you all right?" Pip called out, helping one of his men up. "The creature, it's buried," Anderson said, his voice flat, staring at the tomb of rock. "It's gone." But it was not. A faint scratching sound could be heard from the other side of the rubble. Then a scraping, then the sound of a large rock being shifted. Slowly, painstakingly, a gap began to form. A single, leather-clad hand emerged. Then an arm. The hunter was digging their way out. When they finally emerged from the tomb they had so nearly occupied, they were a ruin. Their long coat was shredded, their tricorn hat gone, so revealing a pale, grim-faced visage streaked with blood and grime. Their left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. A jagged piece of shrapnel was embedded deep in their right thigh, and blood, their own dark and precious blood, was soaking through the leather. They staggered, leaning heavily against the corridor wall, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. It was the first time any of them had seen the hunter truly wounded, truly vulnerable. The sight was deeply unsettling. The myth of the unstoppable phantom was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a mortal body pushed beyond its limits. The hunter fumbled inside their ruined coat, their movements clumsy with pain. Their hand emerged, clutching one of the strange, syringe-like blood vials. It was their last one. They jammed the needle into their thigh, undepressing the plunger. The dark blood flowed into them, and the effect was both immediate and grotesque. Flesh writhed and knitted together. The shrapnel was pushed from the wound with a wet sucking sound. They grabbed their broken left arm and, with a sickening crack that echoed in the corridor, set it back into place. The healing was not clean or divine like Anderson's. It was visceral, aggressive, a brutal act of biological self-repair that was horrifying to witness. But as the wounds closed, a new and more profound horror dawned in the hunter's mind. They reached for the warmth, the connection, the comforting presence that had always been there after every death, every near-fatal wound. They reached for the hunter's dream, and for the first time, there was nothing. The line was dead. The anchor was gone. The promise of rebirth, from the very foundation of their endless cycle of hunt, die, awaken, was severed. There was no doll to soothe them, no gairman to guide them, no workshop to mend their soul. The healing from the vial was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting echo of a power that was no longer theirs. The pain in their body subsided, but it was replaced by a new, colder, and far more terrifying agony, the absolute certainty of their own mortality. Death, here in this alien world, was final. The dream was over. The nightmare had just begun. The return to Hellsing Manor was a silent, tense affair. The hunter sat in the corner of the transport helicopter, a still, brooding presence that was somehow more menacing in its wounded state than it had been at its peak. They ignored the medics who tried to approach them, their gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, but they were not seeing the Irish countryside rushing by below. They were staring into a new, terrifying abyss that had opened within them, the void left by the severed dream. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Death had always been a transition, a brief, painful lesson before awakening on the cold stone of the dream's workshop. It was a tactical resource, a way to reset, rearm, and re-engage. Now, it was the end. The final, irreversible conclusion. The few remaining quicksilver bullets in their pouch felt heavier, each one a choice that could not be unmade. Their saw cleaver, a tool for an endless task, now felt like a desperate man's last resort. The hunt had always been a matter of how. Now it was a matter of if. Anderson, patched up and brooding, had been picked up by his own Iscariot transport. So he had not said another word to the hunter, but he had watched them with a strange, conflicted intensity as they were led away. He had seen a monster, a heretic, and a savior, all in the space of an hour. The theological puzzle of the hunter was one that would fester in his mind. Back in the subterranean levels of the Hellsing compound, the hunter was left alone in a Spartan room, more a cell than a quarter. Integra had seen the after-action report and understood the implications. Her impossible weapon was breakable. For the first time, she provided not a threat, but resources. A simple cot was in the room, along with a tray of food and water, which the hunter ignored. More importantly, laid out on a steel table was an arsenal of modern firearms. A standard Hellsing issue, AR-16 assault rifle, a jackal, Alucard's own monstrous hand cannon, grenades, a combat knife. They were alien things, tools of a different kind of war. The hunter picked up the assault rifle. It was heavy, clumsy, a machine of springs and levers. It lacked the elegant, almost biological simplicity of their trick weapon. They worked the action, pulled the magazine, studied the brass-cased cartridges. The mechanism was crude, loud. It was a thing of pure physics, lacking the arcane spark of a workshop creation. Their hands, however, were instruments of adaptation. They had learned the intricate, transformative mechanics of trick weapons, the timing of a quicksilver-fueled parry. Learning this new tool was a matter of muscle memory and application. They spent hours in the silence of their room, dismantling and reassembling the weapon, getting a feel for its weight, honoring its balance, its cold, mechanical soul. They would not be as fluid with it as they were with their own weapons, but they could make it function. They could make it kill. Their greatest adaptation, however, came from a place of instinct. They thought back to the duel with Anderson. The priest had been too fast, his healing too absolute for a simple war of attrition. But there had been a moment, a single, fleeting instant, when their bullet had struck, where he had staggered. The timing had been off, the result not what they expected. But the principle was the same. A precisely timed shot, delivered at the peak of an enemy's attack, could create an opening, a stagger, a visceral opportunity. The artificial vampires, the freaks, were the key. Their movements were jerky, programmed, predictable, and they were perfect practice dummies. The next time Hellsing Intelligence located a small, isolated Millennium cell operating out of a warehouse in the London Docklands, the hunter did not just accept the mission, they demanded it. They went alone. No wild geese, no backup. Integra, intrigued, had authorized it, watching through a drone feed from the safety of her command center. The hunter entered the warehouse not as a whirlwind of steel, but as a ghost. They dispatched the human sentries with silent, brutal efficiency, their combat knife a more intimate, if less elegant, tool than their cleaver. Inside, 4 freaks stood guard. The hunter let them see them, stepping from the shadows with the saw cleaver held in a ready stance. As the first freak charged, its arms outstretched for a clumsy grapple, the hunter did not dodge, but they stood their ground. At the last possible second, as the creature's attack was fully committed, the hunter's arm blurred. It was not the hunter pistol they fired, but the Hellsing AR-16, held one-handed in a rock-steady grip. A single, precisely aimed shot. The 5.56mm round, far more powerful than a quicksilver bullet, struck the freak square in the chest. The impact was devastating. The creature was thrown from its feet, a huge chunk of its torso vaporized. But more importantly, there was a sound, a high-pitched, ethereal chime that only the hunter could hear. It was the sound of a successful parry, the echo of an old law asserting itself in this new reality. The freak was on the ground, helpless, a gaping wound in its chest, its internal mechanisms sparking. The hunter was on it in an instant. Their left hand, and no longer seeking a beastly heart, plunged into the wound, fingers closing around the freak chip, the metallic core of the creature's unholy existence. And then they pulled. The result was explosive. A visceral attack on a beast tore out its very soul, rewarding the hunter with a surge of life and echoes. A visceral attack on these technological abominations had a different but equally spectacular effect. The hunter ripped the chip free, trailing a shower of sparks and wires. The freak convulsed violently, and then its entire upper torso erupted in a shower of gore and shrapnel as its power source catastrophically failed. Integra, watching on her screen, dropped her cigar. "My God," she breathed. She was witnessing the birth of a new combat doctrine. The hunter had not just learned to use their weapons. None, they had integrated them into their own arcane, terrifying martial art. They had taken the soulless technology of modern warfare and turned it into a bloody sacrament. The remaining 3 freaks charged. The hunter was a dance of death. Bang! The chime, a lunge, a brutal act of manual disassembly, an explosion of gore. Bang! The chime. A roll, a cleaver strike to the leg to cripple it, followed by the final, visceral coup de grace. It was a symphony of violence, a perfect fusion of Yharnam's ancient rites and the brutal realities of 21st century warfare. The hunter stood in the silent warehouse, surrounded by the smoldering, disemboweled husks of the machines. They felt the familiar, exhilarating rush of a successful hunt, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed technique. But the feeling was hollow. There were no echoes to absorb, and no rush of stolen life to mend their wounds. It was a purely intellectual victory. They had adapted. They had learned to kill these new beasts. But the price of this knowledge was the stark, cold certainty that they were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The first sign of the coming apocalypse was not a thunderclap or a scream, but a voice. A cheerful, avuncular voice that crackled to life over every speaker in the Hellsing Manor, overriding all other communications. It spoke of a beautiful moon, a perfect night for a war, and a 50-year-old promise. On the main command screen, the smug, cherubic face of the Major appeared, broadcasting from the bridge of his colossal Zeppelin, the Hindenburg II. "My dear Sir Integra," the voice chirped, filled with an insane, joyous glee. "Attention, attention, we are about to begin our magnificent, soul-stirring war." Outside, the sky filled with the droning hum of engines. A fleet of war zeppelins blotted out the moon, their bellies opening to unleash a flood of soldiers in drop pods and on grav platforms. And they were the last battalion, 1,000 SS vampire soldiers, armed to the teeth and hungry for a slaughter 50 years in the making. Alarms blared through the manor. "Code Red, all hands to battle stations." Pip Bernadotte's voice was a gravelly roar over the comms, a stark contrast to the Major's theatricality. "This is not a drill. Repel borders. For God's sake, repel all borders." The wild geese were professionals. They met the first wave of Millennium soldiers with disciplined volleys of fire, turning the grand hallways of the manor into kill zones. But the enemy was relentless. They were vampires, supernaturally strong and fast, and for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, their MP40 spitting death. The mercenaries' lines began to buckle, their controlled retreats becoming desperate scrambles for cover, and the pristine, polished floors of the manor were soon slick with the blood of both sides. Integra stood on the command dais, a statue of icy calm amidst the chaos, her cigar clenched between her teeth. She watched the casualty reports scroll across her screen, a rising tide of red. Her soldiers were dying, her fortress was being overrun. Alucard was trapped on the captured aircraft carrier, a continent away. Her trump card was off the board. But she had another, an ace in the hole. a wild card. "Walter," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. The old butler, his face a grim, emotionless mask, was by her side in an instant. "Yes, Sir Integra. The situation is untenable. Our conventional forces cannot hold them." She took a long, slow drag from her cigar, the tip burning like a bale fire. "Release the hunter." Walter nodded once, and a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He turned and walked to a secure communications panel. "Containment Cell Block D, override Security Protocol Omega. Open the door to Specimen 7. Authorization, Hellsing." Deep in the subterranean levels, the hunter sat on their cot, the saw cleaver resting across their lap. They had not needed the alarms or the frantic comms chatter to know what was happening. They could smell it. The thick, coppery scent of fresh spilled blood, a veritable ocean of it, was seeping through the ventilation system. It was a symphony of slaughter, a glorious, irresistible call to the hunt. Their head was cocked, listening to the distant, rhythmic thunder of explosions and gunfire. A low growl rumbled in their chest. They were a caged predator, and the world outside had just turned into their perfect hunting ground. With a heavy, pneumatic hiss, the reinforced steel door to their cell slid open. The hunter rose to their feet in a single, fluid motion. They were already armed. The saw cleaver was in their right hand. The Hellsing assault rifle, now their chosen tool for the parry, was slung over their back. They stepped out into the corridor, their eyes, hidden in shadow, already scanning for the quickest path to the surface, to the heart of the glorious, bloody chaos. They emerged into the manor's grand foyer just as a squad of wild geese was being overwhelmed. A dozen Millennium vampires were swarming over their barricade of overturned furniture, their bayonets and machine pistols working with grim efficiency. Pip Bernadotte, his eye patch gone and a bloody gash across his face, was desperately trying to rally his men. He never got the chance. A black blur shot past him. The hunter entered the fray not like a soldier, but like a natural disaster. The lead vampire turned, its face a rictus of triumph, only to have its head vaporized by a single, impossibly fast shot from the Hellsing rifle. The ethereal chime of a successful parry rang in the hunter's ears. Before the headless corpse had even begun to fall, the hunter was on it, their left hand plunging into its chest. They ripped out the freak chip, and the vampire exploded, the concussive force sending the two soldiers next to it flying like dolls. The other vampires paused, their programming momentarily stuttering at this bizarre, unforeseen event. It was all the time the hunter needed. So with a flick of the wrist, the saw cleaver snapped open to its full, gruesome length. The hunter became a whirlwind of death. They were no longer the detached exterminator from the laboratory. This was a true battle, a worthy hunt, and the old bloodlust stirred. They moved with a speed that made the vampires look sluggish. A vampire lunged, and the hunter slid under its attack, the serrated edge of the cleaver disemboweling it from below. Another fired its MP-40, and the hunter used the first corpse as a shield, the bullets thudding into the dead flesh. They dropped the body and fired the rifle from the hip, the bullet staggering a vampire in the back rank. A quick step, covering 10 feet in the blink of an eye, brought them face to face with their stunned prey. The cleaver fell, splitting the vampire from scalp to sternum. Pip and his surviving men could only stare, their rifles lowered. They were witnessing a different kind of war. The hunter did not use cover. They did not fire in bursts. They were a maelstrom of constant, aggressive motion, an engine of pure, unadulterated violence that bent the battle to their will. He's not fighting them, one of the mercenaries stammered, his face pale with shock. He's playing with them. The hunter cleared the foyer in less than a minute, leaving behind a charnel house of mangled limbs and exploded torsos. They stood for a moment in the center of the carnage, their coats soaked in a fresh layer of gore. They were not breathing heavily. They did not look tired. their head tilted, listening to the sounds of fighting deeper within the manor. The scent of blood was everywhere. The hunt had just begun. As without a word, without a look back at the soldiers whose lives they had just saved, they sprinted down a corridor, a silent, bloody phantom drawn to the next battle. The Hellsing Manor had become a labyrinth of echoes and screams. For the hunter, it was a familiar song, a return to the blood-drenched streets of Yharnam. They moved through the besieged estate not as a soldier defending a post, but as a force of nature scouring a blighted landscape. They did not follow the battle plans of the wild geese or the frantic orders crackling over the comms. They followed the scent of blood, the sound of combat, the irresistible pull of the hunt. Pip and his men, falling back to a more defensible position in the west wing, saw the hunter flow past them down a corridor swarming with Millennium troops. They didn't even seem to register the mercenaries' presence. "Where the hell is he going?" one of Pip's men asked, reloading a fresh magazine. "Where the fighting is thickest," Pip grunted, wiping blood from his brow. "He's not reinforcing us. He's culling the herd." They watched as the hunter engaged the enemy squad. It was a terrifying spectacle of efficiency. A shot from the rifle to create an opening, a brutal cleaver strike to dismember, a visceral detonation to clear space. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, no cruelty. It was the cold, lethal geometry of a predator at work. To the vampires, it was like fighting a phantom, a glitch in reality that could not be shot or stabbed effectively. To the humans, it was like watching a master craftsman whose craft just happened to be butchery. There was an artistry to it, but it was a cold, terrifying art, devoid of the passion or rage that fuels a human soldier. Meanwhile, half a world away on the cold, windswept deck of the captured Eagle, another monster was at play. Alucard, having finally dispatched Rip Van Winkle and her magic bullet, was wading through the remnants of the carrier's Millennium crew. For him, this was not a hunt. It was an extermination, a glorious, one-sided slaughter that served as a fine aperitif for the main course he knew was unfolding in London. "Come then, my little tin soldiers," he bellowed, his voice a mocking roar that carried over the howl of the wind. "Show me the superiority of your 1,000-year Reich." His twin cannons, the Castle and the Jackal, barked and roared, each shot turning a vampire soldier into a cloud of red mist and shattered bone. And he didn't just kill them, he toyed with them, disassembled them, humiliated them. He let them empty their magazines into his chest, the bullets vanishing into his shadowy form with wet, sucking sounds, only to reappear a moment later as he regenerated with a theatrical laugh. He unleashed Baskerville, his demonic hellhound, a tide of shadows and gnashing teeth that swept across the deck, consuming soldiers whole. He was a symphony of death, a crimson maestro conducting an orchestra of screams and gunfire. He was everything the hunter was not, loud, arrogant, and filled with a deep, sadistic joy in his work. It was in the midst of this gleeful carnage that he felt it, a subtle vibration on the psychic plane, a thread of resonance that cut through the noise of his own war. It was a familiar signature. It was the one he had tasted in the interrogation room. It was the hunter. It was not a call for help, not a cry of pain, but a song of slaughter, sung in a different key from his own. His melody was a bombastic, operatic aria of overwhelming power and cruelty. This was different. It was a low, steady, relentless drum beat, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated purpose. Kill, target, kill, target. A metronome of death clicking with a precision that was utterly devoid of passion. He could feel it from across the ocean, a psychic echo of the carnage unfolding in his master's home. He could feel the artificial vampires dying, their cheap, manufactured souls being extinguished not with contempt, but with a chilling, dispassionate finality. Alucard paused, his grin momentarily fading as he held a terrified Millennium soldier aloft by the throat. So as he closed his eyes, concentrating on that distant signal, he saw it then, not as a vision, but as an understanding. He saw the empty penitent, the walking crusade with no god, unleashed in the halls of his home. He saw the saw cleaver rising and falling, the rifle barking its single, staggering shot, the explosive finale of the visceral attack. A slow, genuine smile spread across Alucard's face. It was not his usual mocking sneer. It was a smile of profound, almost reverent recognition. He and the hunter were antitheses. He was a creature of excess, of emotion, of a million stolen souls screaming within him. The hunter was a creature of absolute zero, an empty vessel filled only with the hunt itself. But they were both monsters. They were both beings defined and trapped by an endless war. He was a king in a prison of his own making, was a curse of immortality that he secretly loathed. The hunter was a prisoner of their own purpose, a slave to a hunt that could never end, even in a new world. It was the same cage, just with different bars, and in that there was a strange, terrible kinship. He was not the only true monster on the board anymore. "How beautiful," Alucard whispered, his voice filled with a newfound, terrifying joy. He opened his blood-red eyes, his grin returning, wider and more predatory than ever. He looked at the trembling soldier in his grasp. "You are blessed," he purred, "to die in a world that contains such magnificent things." He then crushed the man's head like a grape. He felt a new urgency. He had to finish his own little war. He wanted to get home. He wanted to see his fellow monster's handiwork for himself. The battle for Hellsing Manor raged for hours, a relentless tide of violence that ebbed and flowed through the ancient building. The hunter had become the eye of the storm, a silent, mobile epicenter of death around which the larger conflict swirled. They had carved a bloody swathe through the lower floors and were now ascending, drawn by the sounds of the most intense fighting near Integra's command center. They burst into the main library, a grand, two-story chamber lined with centuries of knowledge. The room had been turned into a fortress. The wild geese had established a final defensive line behind barricades of antique desks and priceless books, but they were being systematically dismantled. The attacker was not a mindless freak or a disciplined soldier. It was a beast. He was immense, clad in the field-gray uniform of a Wehrmacht captain, but no human could possess such a monstrous frame. He moved with a heavy, deliberate calm, shrugging off assault rifle fire as if it were a mild irritant. A silver cross dangled from his neck, and his face, framed by shaggy, lupine hair, was locked in a perpetual, unnerving smirk. This was Captain Hans Günsche, the Major's personal bodyguard and the trump card of the ground assault. He was not a vampire, he was something else, something older. As the hunter entered, the captain was in the process of tearing a heavy machine gun emplacement from its moorings, the mercenaries crewing it scattered like broken dolls. He turned, his unnerving smile not faltering as he saw the new arrival. His senses, far keener than any vampire's, told him this was no mere human. He smelled blood, some old and strange, and something else. The scent of a predator, an equal. The hunter's gaze locked onto the captain. For the first time since arriving in this world, they felt a flicker of the old thrill, the pure, exhilarating terror of facing a true beast. This was not a shambling ghoul or a manufactured puppet. This was a creature of immense power and savage grace. The size, the unnatural strength, the lupine features. It was a terrifying echo of the cleric beasts of Vicar Amelia, of the very scourge they were born to cleanse. The rifle felt suddenly inadequate, the modern tactics of the parry and detonate technique too crude for this. This required the old ways. With a flick of their wrist, the saw cleaver extended to its full length. The hunter dropped into a low, predatory crouch, ignoring the few remaining wild geese. And the world narrowed to two beings, the hunter and the beast. The captain seemed to understand. He gave a slight, almost respectful nod. Then with a sound of cracking bone and tearing cloth, his body began to contort, grew larger, his muscles swelling, his skin erupting in a coat of thick white fur. His face elongated into a monstrous lupine snout, his teeth lengthening into vicious fangs. He was a werewolf, a true lycanthrope, a creature of nightmare made manifest. He let out a low, guttural growl, a promise of a savage, bloody death. He charged. He was not a clumsy, lurching beast, but a blur of white fur and claws, covering the 50 feet between them in a heartbeat. The hunter met the charge, not with force, but with impossible agility. They quick-stepped to the side, the werewolf's claws scything through the air, to shattering the marble bust of a long-dead Hellsing. The hunter's cleaver whistled, scoring a deep gash along the beast's flank. The werewolf roared, a sound of surprise and pain, but the wound was already closing, mist-like tendrils sealing the flesh. He was a creature of regeneration, just like Anderson, but his was a primal, savage miracle, not a divine one. He spun, his massive arm swinging in a blow that could pulverize stone. The hunter ducked under it, the wind of its passage stirring their hair. They came up close, inside the beast's guard, and fired the assault rifle. The bullet, fired at point-blank range into the werewolf's torso, didn't even make him flinch. He was a solid wall of supernatural muscle. This confirmed it. The parry was useless here. The duel became a deadly dance. The hunter was outmatched in strength and raw power, but they were superior in speed and skill. They were a ghost, a phantom of leather and steel, always just beyond the reach of the werewolf's claws. They used the library to their advantage, vaulting over tables, sliding under collapsing bookshelves, their cleaver darting in to inflict a dozen shallow cuts, testing the limits of the beast's regenerative abilities. The captain was becoming frustrated. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a feral snarl. He was fighting a creature that defied all his experience. It was mortal. He could smell its blood, feel the satisfying crunch as one of his blows finally connected, sending the hunter tumbling across the floor. But the creature simply rose, its movements perhaps a fraction slower, a grunt of pain the only sign of injury, until the dance continued. He was fighting something that did not seem to understand the concept of pain or fear. Pip Bernadotte, his arm broken and his pistol empty, watched in stunned disbelief. He had seen Alucard fight. Alucard was an overwhelming force, a god of death who annihilated his enemies. The hunter did not annihilate. They dissected. They were a scalpel, patiently and methodically taking the beast apart, learning its movements, its strengths, its weaknesses, all while weathering blows that would have turned any of his men into a red paste. The hunter knew they could not win a battle of attrition. Their own mortality was a dwindling resource. They needed to end this. They needed a decisive blow. They saw their opening. The werewolf, in its frustration, lunged in a wild, telegraphed attack, both claws extended to rip and tear, as it was a move of pure, animalistic rage. The hunter did not dodge back. They dodged in. In a move of breathtaking audacity, they quick-stepped directly into the beast's attack, under its outstretched arms. For a split second, they were chest to chest with the monster. The werewolf's yellow eyes widened in shock. The hunter's left hand, now free, shot up. It was not a visceral attack. It was a simple, brutal, physical act. They plunged their fingers into the deep, still-healing gash they had opened on the werewolf's flank at the start of the fight. With a guttural roar that was their own, the hunter pulled, using the werewolf's own forward momentum against it. They tore the wound open, their fingers digging for purchase on muscle and bone. The werewolf howled, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, its attack forgotten as it was thrown off balance. In that single, critical moment of vulnerability, the hunter brought their cleaver, held in a reverse grip up and under the beast's exposed throat. The serrated blade bit deep, grinding on vertebrae, and with a final desperate surge of strength, the hunter tore sideways. The library was filled with the sound of a wet, heavy curtain being ripped in two. The werewolf werewolf's howl died in a gurgle. Its massive head, attached by only a few remaining sinews, lolled back at an impossible angle. The colossal body staggered for a moment, then crashed to the floor, silent and still. The hunter stood over the corpse, breathing heavily, their bodies screaming in protest from a dozen bruises and at least one broken rib. They had done it. They had faced the ultimate beast of this new world. And they had won. But the cost was high. They were wounded, exhausted, and the mana was still screaming. The corpse of the werewolf had not yet cooled when the new threat announced itself. It was not a roar or an explosion, but a song. A high, piercing soprano voice, carrying over the wind and the remaining sounds of battle, singing a joyful, murderous aria from Der Freischütz. Pip Bernadotte, propped against a shattered bookshelf with a makeshift splint on his arm, recognized it immediately. His face, already pale from blood loss, went chalk white. "Merde," he hissed, his voice a strained whisper. "Everyone away from the windows. Now, c'est la sorcière, the witch." His warning came a fraction of a second too late. One of the surviving mercenaries, peering over the barricade to get a look at the sky. It was suddenly thrown back as if punched by a giant's fist. A perfectly round, cauterized hole was burned straight through his chest. There was no sound of a gunshot, no crack of a sniper rifle, only the triumphant crescendo of the distant singing. The hunter's head snapped up. Their senses, honed to detect the subtlest shifts in a battlefield, reached out to this new enemy. They couldn't see the singer, but they could feel the attack. It was not a physical projectile in the conventional sense. As another mercenary was struck down, the hunter's insight granted them a terrifying clarity. They saw it, a shimmering, ethereal trail of blue-white energy, a line of pure, malevolent intent that twisted and curved through the air, ignoring wind and gravity before it found its target. It was like the arcane bolts of the choir, or the seeking cosmic horrors summoned by the kin. It was a weaponized concept, a bullet that hunted its prey by sheer force of will. "We're pinned!" another soldier yelled, cowering behind a thick oak desk as a magic bullet swerved in through a window, performed a sharp right-angled turn, and blasted a grandfather clock into splinters. "We can't fight back. We can't even see her." They were trapped, but the hunter was not a soldier who relied on cover and firing lines. They were a predator, and the only way to deal with a threat was to meet it head-on. The singing was coming from above. The roof. That was the destination. Without a word, the hunter broke from the relative safety of the library, sprinting into the main hallway. "Wait! You'll be a target in the open!" Pip yelled after them, but it was useless. The hunter was already a black-clad blur, their tattered coat flying behind them. The moment they entered the hallway, a shimmering blue line locked onto them. The aria from the sky turned playful, a cat teasing a mouse. The hunter felt the psychic pressure of the incoming attack and quick stepped to the right. The magic bullet, homing in on their original position, smashed through the wall behind them, pulverizing ancient portraits and plaster. It did not stop. The bullet curved, its ethereal trail bending impossibly as it reacquired its target. The ascent through Hellsing Manor became a desperate, high-stakes ballet. The hunter was not just running, they were navigating a storm of homing death. They raced up the grand staircase, the magic bullet in hot pursuit. It was gaining. The hunter could feel the heat of it on their back. And at the top of the stairs, they did not follow the landing. They leaped, launching themselves across the open atrium, their broken ribs screaming in protest. They landed in a silent roll on the opposite balcony, just as the bullet slammed into the staircase they had just abandoned, obliterating a 10-foot section of marble and wrought iron. The singing from outside grew more excited, more gleeful. This was a fun game. The hunter sprinted down a long gallery, lined with suits of armor. 2 more shimmering trails of energy appeared, locking onto them from different angles as Rip Van Winkle fired again. Now 3 bullets were hunting them. They smashed through the tall arched windows, their trajectories weaving an intricate net of death. The hunter's mind entered a state of pure, instinctual flow. There was no thought, only reaction. They slid across the polished floor, the first bullet searing the air inches above their head. They pushed off a suit of armor, using it as a launch point to spring sideways as the second bullet detonated the spot they had just occupied. The third bullet, anticipating their trajectory, came straight for them. With no room to dodge, the hunter brought up their saw cleaver. The extended blade met the magical projectile. The impact was immense. The cleaver glowed white-hot, and a shock wave threw the hunter back against the far wall, their arm numb to the shoulder. The bullet was not stopped, but it was deflected, sent careening into the ceiling in a shower of plaster and sparks. The hunter landed hard, their body aching, but they were already moving again, scrambling up the final flight of service stairs that led to the roof. So they burst out into the stormy night air. The rain had subsided to a cold drizzle. Hovering 100 yards away was a sleek, black VTOL aircraft, and standing on its open ramp, as if on a stage, was a tall, lanky woman in a Nazi uniform, her pigtails flying in the wind. She held a ridiculously long flintlock musket, its barrel still smoking. It was Rip Van Winkle. She finished her song with a final, triumphant note, then took a theatrical bow. "Bravo, bravo," she cried, her voice a childish, mocking squeal. "You're a fast little mouse, the fastest I've ever seen, but the opera is over, and now it is time for the grand finale." She began to reload her musket, her movements practiced and deliberate. She was completely confident. The hunter was trapped on the roof with no cover and nowhere to run. The hunter rose to their full height, on their chest heaving. Their body was a wreck, their resources dwindling. The cleaver in their hand was still shimmering with residual heat. The distance was too great. The enemy was in the air. This was an impossible fight. But the hunter did not know the meaning of the word. They slowly raised the Hellsing assault rifle. Rip laughed, a high, mocking sound. "You think that toy can touch me? My bullet is a child of magic and hate. It will pierce your heart and nail you to this roof. It is my Freischütz." She raised her musket, taking aim. A single, brilliant blue line of energy shot out across the sky, aimed directly at the hunter's chest. The hunter did not try to dodge. There was nowhere to go. They stood their ground, the rifle pressed to their shoulder. Their inhuman perception followed the shimmering trail of the magic bullet. But they were not aiming at the distant witch. They were aiming at the attack itself. Time seemed to slow. The world dissolved into the hunter, the rifle, and the incandescent line of approaching death. At the last possible moment, when the bullet was only feet away, they fired a single shot. The Hellsing assault rifle bucked against the hunter's shoulder. The single, brass-cased roundet, fired, was a mundane physical object, a product of chemistry and industry. It was a prayer of science against a hymn of magic. By all the laws of Rip Van Winkle's world, it should have been useless, a gnat trying to stop a hurricane. But the hunter was not of her world. Their timing, their intent, their entire existence was a violation of established reality. The 5.56mm bullet met the shimmering, ethereal form of the magic bullet head-on. There was no explosion, no grand detonation. Instead, for a fraction of a second, the two impossibilities coexisted in the same space. The mundane physical round, fired with a hunter's preternatural timing, did not destroy the magic bullet. It parried it. The ethereal chime that rang was not in the air, but in the hunter's soul. It was the loudest, purest, most resonant parry tone they had ever felt. The magic bullet, its perfect, malevolent trajectory, interrupted at the most critical instant, did not vanish. It faltered. It wobbled in the air like a stunned bird, its blue-white light flickering erratically. It was vulnerable. Rip Van Winkle, watching from the ramp of her VTOL, gasped. Her insane, joyful smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter, stupefied disbelief. It was impossible. No one had ever stopped her Freischütz. It was a perfect conceptual weapon. It could not be blocked. It could not be dodged forever. It simply killed. What? How? She stammered, her voice losing all its theatrical confidence. The hunter did not give her time to recover. The moment the bullet was stunned, they moved. But they did not charge. And they could not leap 100 yards through the air. The saw cleaver was useless. The rifle was empty. They were wounded, cornered, and their enemy was far out of reach. In this moment of absolute crisis, a cold, brutal pragmatism took over. The hunt demanded a kill. The method was irrelevant. Their eyes darted across the rooftop and found him. A single, surviving Hellsing soldier, a young man with terror-wide eyes, was huddled behind a ventilation unit, clutching his rifle. He was wounded, a piece of shrapnel in his leg. But he was alive. He was a resource. The hunter moved with a speed that defied their injuries. They crossed the roof in a blur, grabbing the soldier by the front of his tactical vest and hauling him to his feet. The man cried out in pain and shock. "What are you doing?" The hunter did not answer. They didn't have the words, and even if they did, they would not have wasted the breath. They simply held the struggling, terrified soldier in front of them, using his body as a shield, and ran. They ran directly towards the edge of the roof, towards the hovering VTOL, towards the stunned magic bullet. "No, please, don't!" the soldier screamed, his fists beating uselessly against the hunter's iron grip. Rip Van Winkle watched in horror and confusion. The little mouse was running straight at her, using a wounded man as a living shield. It was a tactic so cold, so monstrously practical, that it shocked even her blood-soaked sensibilities. Her moment of hesitation was fatal. The magic bullet, its guidance system recovering, reacquired its target. But its target was now a composite of two life signs, two heat signatures. Summit locked onto the larger, closer one. The bullet shot forward. The hunter, with a final, desperate surge of strength through the soldier, they didn't just push him, they launched him, a human projectile aimed directly at the faltering magic bullet. The soldier's scream was cut short as the fly chute slammed into his chest, detonating with the force of a grenade. For a horrifying instant, his body was silhouetted against a brilliant flash of blue-white light, and then he was simply gone, vaporized into a cloud of red mist and superheated gas. The sacrifice, however, had served its purpose. It had bought the hunter one precious second. The shockwave of the bullet's premature detonation buffeted them, but they were already in motion, leaping from the edge of the roof. They had used the soldier's death not just as a shield, but as a distraction, a final, brutal gambit. They fell not towards the ground, but towards the VTOL. Rip, her face a mask of shock at the raw, inhuman cruelty she had just witnessed, was completely unprepared. She fumbled with her musket, trying to reload, but it was too late. The hunter slammed onto the transport's ramp with the force of a meteor, the impact buckling the metal. Their momentum carried them forward, and they crashed into the witch, sending them both tumbling into the aircraft's cargo bay. The fight was over in seconds. Rip was a powerful psychic, a witch of the highest order, but in close quarters, stripped of her magical weapon, she was just a lanky woman with a gun that took 2 minutes to reload. The hunter was a master of close-quarters combat, a creature of pure, visceral violence. And they rose from the floor of the cargo bay, their saw cleaver, which had been on their back, now in their hand. Rip scrambled backwards, her face a mess of terror. "Stay back, you monster! You're not human! You're a monster!" The hunter did not reply. They simply raised the cleaver. It fell, swift and final. They stood over her bisected corpse, the gore of the Hellsing soldier and the Millennium witch mingling on their tattered coat. They had won. They had survived, but the cost was a cold, hard knot in their gut. In Yharnam, they had been a hunter of beasts. Tonight, they had learned that to survive in this new, brutal world, they had to become a monster of a different kind. They had sacrificed a human life, a life they were ostensibly there to protect, as coolly and deliberately as they would chamber a bullet. In the line between protector and predator, a line they had never even considered before, had not just been blurred. It had been erased. The VTOL aircraft, its pilot having been dispatched by the hunter in a brief, brutal encounter in the cockpit, drifted aimlessly in the night sky. The sounds of the battle for Hellsing Manor were a distant, muffled echo. Below, London was a sprawling tapestry of lights, a city utterly oblivious to the secret, bloody war being waged for its soul. The hunter stood on the open ramp, the wind whipping at their gore-stiffened coat, a silent, solitary figure surveying a world that was not their own. They were no longer just a participant in the war, they were a vector, a force that had irrevocably altered its course. A crackle in the cockpit's communication system drew their attention. A voice, so the same cheerful, avuncular, and utterly insane voice from the beginning of the assault, filled the small space. It was the Major. He wasn't broadcasting to the city or to his troops. The signal was narrow, focused, and directed specifically at this aircraft. He had been watching. "Wunderbar! Oh, truly, truly wunderbar!" The Major's voice chirped, filled with the giddy excitement of a child on Christmas morning. "An artist, a true artist of violence. You have exceeded all of my projections. First my dog, Hans, and now my dear sweet songbird, Rip. You have dismantled my beautiful orchestra, piece by piece. I am not even angry. I am in awe." The hunter walked into the cockpit and stood over the dead pilot, their gaze falling on the communications console where a small screen showed the Major's grinning, cherubic face. And there was no triumph in his expression, no hint of defeat, only a pure, ecstatic appreciation for the spectacle. "I've been watching you, you see," the Major continued, his voice dropping into a more conspiratorial, philosophical tone. "Ever since you first appeared in that alley. You are the perfect variable. You do not fight for a king or a country or a god. You do not fight for revenge or for glory. You are not even a true monster, driven by hunger or instinct. You are the thing I've dreamed of my entire life. You are war made manifest. You are the perfect, beautiful, unadulterated will to conflict." The hunter remained silent, their head tilted slightly. They were listening, not to the words, but to the intent behind them. They had faced beasts, madmen, and gods. They knew the shape of obsession, because in this man's obsession was a monument. "Do you know why we fight, my silent, bloody friend?" the Major asked, his tone becoming that of a professor lecturing his favorite student. "Hellsing fights for duty. Iscariot fights for faith. Alucard fights to stave off the crushing boredom of his own immortality. They all have reasons, excuses that dilute the purity of the act. But you have no such illusions, and neither do I. I love war. I love every aspect of it. The sound, the smell, the desperate struggle, the ultimate, beautiful finality of it all." He leaned closer to his camera, his round glasses reflecting the lights of his own command bridge. "But my war, my beautiful symphony of death, requires a worthy opponent, a true monster to stand against my own. Alucard was to be my final masterpiece, the ultimate antagonist. But you are something more. Alucard is a monster pretending to be a man. You are something that has forgotten it was ever a man at all, and has become something purer." The Major's monologue was not a plea, or a threat, or a surrender. It was a sermon, a confession of faith from one zealot to another. He was not trying to recruit the hunter, or even to understand them in a conventional sense. He was recognizing them. He was seeing the empty, purpose-driven core of their being, the part that had been scoured clean by the hunter's dream, and he was worshipping it. He saw the cold, pragmatic choice they had made on the rooftop, the sacrifice of the Hellsing soldier, and he did not see it as an act of cruelty, but as an act of sublime, beautiful logic. The logic of total war. "You and I," We are the only two honest beings in this entire conflict, the Major stated, his voice filled with a profound, almost religious conviction. We understand the truth, that the struggle itself is the point, the victory, the defeat. They are just the final, fleeting notes of the song. The music is in the fighting. He sighed, a sound of pure contentment. I have lost my finest soldiers tonight. My beautiful Zeppelin is burning over the Thames. My 50-year plan is in ruins. And I have never been happier, because I have seen you, and I know with absolute certainty that even if Hellsing wins this night, my war, my true war, will never be over as long as a creature like you exists in the world. The Major's face vanished from the screen, replaced by static. The communication was cut. The sermon was over. The hunter stood in the silent cockpit, the drone of the engines the only sound. They felt no kinship with the madman, no flicker of understanding. The Major's love for war was an intellectual, philosophical passion. The hunter's purpose was far more fundamental. It was not a love, but a need, a function, the very reason for their existence. They had listened to the ravings of Mikolash in his nightmare school, the whispers of the great ones in the cosmos. The Major was just another madman, singing his own insane song in a world full of them. But he was right about one thing. The war was not over. It would never be over. Because there were still beasts in this world. They just had different faces. The hunter turned and walked back to the open ramp, their eyes scanning the city below. The hunt was all that mattered. The prey was everywhere. By the time the hunter guided the drifting VTOL back toward the Hellsing estate, the battle was over. The first rays of a bleak grey dawn were breaking over a scene of utter devastation. The Grand Manor was a burning, smoking ruin. The lawns were a charnel house, littered with the bodies of Hellsing mercenaries and Millennium vampires alike. The last battalion's ground assault had been broken, but at a catastrophic cost. The hunter landed the aircraft on a patch of scorched earth, its engines whining down into silence. They stepped out onto the field of slaughter, a solitary, blood-caked figure in the morning mist. The scent of death was overwhelming, a thick, cloying miasma of burnt cordite, cooked flesh, and spilled blood. Survivors were beginning to emerge from the wreckage, their faces blackened with soot, from their eyes hollow with shock and exhaustion. Pip Bernadotte was among them, directing the establishment of a triage center for the handful of wounded. He saw the hunter, and for a moment his weary face hardened. He had heard the reports from the soldier who had witnessed the event on the rooftop. He knew the price of the witch's death. Integra Hellsing stood on the shattered remains of the manor's front steps, her crisp suit torn and filthy, a fresh cigar clenched in her teeth. She looked out over the ruins of her ancestral home, her face an unreadable mask of iron will. As the hunter approached, she turned her head, her sharp blue eyes fixing on them. There was no gratitude in her gaze, no anger. There was only the cold, hard calculus of a commander assessing her assets. The Major's fleet is in ruins. Alucard has scuttled their flagship over the Thames, she stated, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. The primary threat is neutralized. Your performance was effective. Effective was the only word she could use. Heroic did not apply. Monstrous was perhaps more accurate, but she commanded monsters. It was the nature of her work. At that moment, a new figure appeared, striding through the carnage with an unnerving, fluid grace. It was Alucard. He had returned. His red duster was immaculate. His grin was a slash of predatory triumph. He had a new, or rather, an old look. He was no longer the tall, lanky man he had been. He had reverted to his form as the girl, Girlycard, a young, androgynous figure with wild black hair and burning red eyes. It was a form he took when he was at his most serious, or his most playful. With him, so it was often hard to tell the difference. "Master," the vampire chirped, their voice a feminine alto. I have returned from my little boat trip. It seems I missed the party." Their eyes swept over the devastation, a flicker of genuine amusement in them. Then their gaze fell upon the hunter. The amusement vanished, replaced by that same profound recognition he had felt on the carrier. He walked a slow circle around the hunter, his head cocked, examining them like a connoisseur, appreciating a fine, lethal sculpture. "The scent of a werewolf. And my dear Rip, all over you," Alucard mused. "You have been busy. You fight not with joy or with hatred. You fight like a surgeon removing a cancer. So cold, so quiet, so beautifully, perfectly empty." The hunters stood impassive under the scrutiny of the two beings who now controlled their fate. When they were a weapon, and the war for which they had been unleashed was, for the moment, over. They were an instrument with no song to play. "The asset is compromised," Integra said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "It is a mortal tool, and it has proven unpredictable in its methods." She looked at the hunter, a finality in her gaze. "Its purpose is served. We have no further use for it." The implication was clear. A tool that was no longer useful was to be discarded, stored away in a cell, or perhaps disposed of more permanently. Alucard laughed, a high musical sound that was deeply unsettling coming from the girlish form. "No further use? My master, you wound me, and you insult our guest. This is not a tool, this is a pilgrim. A holy warrior from a church of blood, cast adrift in a land of heathens. To lock it away would be a sin." He turned to the hunter, his red eyes boring into the shadows of their hat. "Your hunt is over here. The beasts have been slain. My master will rebuild her house, Iscariot will lick its wounds, and the world will forget this night ever happened. But you cannot forget, can you? The silence is what you fear, the end of the hunt." Alucard was right. In the quiet of the dawn, with the scent of blood fading, the hunter felt a familiar, creeping dread. The hollowness, the lack of purpose, the silence that came after the kill. "So go," Alucard said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your leash is cut. This world is larger and more full of monsters than this little island. Tyrants in their palaces, warlords in the desert, cartels in the jungle, men who make beasts of other men. A whole world of filth to be cleansed, a whole world of prey." He smiled, a true, terrible, and perhaps even compassionate smile. "Go and find a new hunt. It is the only thing you were ever made for." Integra watched this exchange, her cigar smoldering. Alucard was giving their weapon a way out, an exile, letting the problem simply walk away. It was a risk, but perhaps a calculated one. To try and contain or destroy the hunter would be a costly, bloody affair. To simply let them loose upon the world's wicked. It was a strange, grim sort of poetry. The hunter looked from Integra's cold, pragmatic gaze to Alucard's knowing, monstrous one. They had been a prisoner of the dream, then a tool of Hellsing. Now they were being offered nothing, an absence of purpose, a void they had to fill themselves. And they turned their back on the vampire and the iron-willed woman. They turned their back on the smoking ruins of the manor and the field of the dead, and they began to walk. They walked past the shell-shocked mercenaries and the makeshift triage centers. No one tried to stop them. They were a ghost, a nightmare that had served its purpose and was now fading with the morning light. They walked until they reached the main road, a simple strip of asphalt that led back to London, and from there to the rest of the world. They did not know where they were going. They had no plan, no destination. They had only the echo of Alucard's words and the deep, instinctual certainty that he was right. The world was full of beasts, and a new, endless night of the hunt was about to begin. The ashes of Hellsing Manor settled, a grey shroud over a costly victory. In the years that followed, the world's shadows deepened, but the monsters that lurked within them began to whisper new stories. They were not tales of the no-life king or the fanatics of Iscariot. They spoke of a silent, grey-clad figure, a hunter who moved like a phantom through the wars of men and the secret conflicts of the night. They spoke of a serrated cleaver that sang a song of dismemberment and a single gunshot that heralded an explosive, visceral end. The hunter, cut loose from prophecy and destiny, had become a legend, a bloody folk tale told by the very creatures that preyed on humanity. Their journey was a grim pilgrimage. They were seen in the jungles of South America, dismantling a drug cartel that used vampiric shock troops. And they were glimpsed in the war-torn cities of the Middle East, a silent force of death cutting through extremists who had dabbled in the occult. They hunted not for nation, nor for creed, nor for any master. They hunted because the scent of blood was on the wind, because the world was rife with beasts masquerading as men. They had traded the cosmic horror of Yharnam for the mundane, yet infinitely more vast, horror of human cruelty. The lesson they learned on that rooftop, the cold calculus of sacrifice, became their new creed. They were no longer a hero or a protector. They were a cure, and the cure was as brutal and terrifying as the disease. The hunter's dream was dead, but their endless hunt had just found a new, larger world to consume. What if scenario should we explore next? Let us know your dream crossovers in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into a new nightmare, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story.